an intro.
So we'll go ahead and just give folks a couple minutes to call in, Johnny and Jenna. Good afternoon, folks. Nice to see people signing in. We'll just give people another minute or two, and then we'll go ahead and get started with today's webinar. Okay, looks like we've hit critical mass, so we'll go ahead and get started. Nice to see lots of folks signing in. I know it's the beginning of the new academic year for many of us. It can be a tricky time, so thank you everybody for calling in today. Just a little bit of housekeeping, and then we will get started with today's webinar. So we've got a few upcoming talks. We've got talks scheduled for the rest of the year, so I've just put into the chat box our upcoming speakers. On October 13th, we'll hear from Shazeen Attari from Indiana University. November 10th, Cameron Brick from the University of Amsterdam, and December 8th from Neil Lewis Jr. at Cornell University. So I'm really pleased with these last 4 talks in this first year of the Division 34 webinar series. I'm also really pleased to let folks know that we're going to be continuing the webinar series into 2021 under the leadership of our new president, Daniel Benkendorf. So I hope that many of you will continue to call in for future webinar sessions. So today I'm really pleased to introduce and hear from our next 2 speakers in the webinar series, Jena Barchas-Lichtenstein and John Fraser. Jen is a linguistic anthropologist and researcher at Knology, where her work focuses primarily on how media circulates and what that means for questions of both learning and representation. And she's particularly interested in how people communicate uncertainty and how approaches used for this purpose by scientific and journalistic practices differ. John is a conservation psychologist, architect, and educator. He has many degrees to his name. As president and CEO of Knology, his research focuses on how our experience with media and community influences learning, attitudes, and motivations for engaging with complex social challenges. And he's particularly concerned with the emotional experience of understanding environmental degradation. So I'm really pleased that they were both able to join us today, and I'll turn it over to them for their talk.
Thanks, Ezra. So we thought we'd jump in with a little bit about us, and obviously, since I'm somewhat known to this group, I just like to distinguish that I see myself as a conservation psychologist, and I distinguish that discipline from environmental psychology in that I look to work with all of the disciplines of psychology in order to figure out how we wean people from the addiction to the overconsumption of natural resources. So I see conservation psychology as literally an interventionist activist discipline. It isn't so much about the reciprocal exchange as much as how we can use that in order to promote conservation of the biosphere. But Jenna, maybe you should explain a little more about linguistic anthropology.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm not known to most of you, I think, but I do want to take a second and differentiate linguistic anthropology from our 2 better known siblings. So the way I distinguish linguistic anthropology from linguistics is this. Most of linguistics focuses on language as a formal system, and linguistic anthropology is really interested in language as a social resource, as a communicative resource in use. Meanwhile, we're quite closely aligned with cultural anthropology in the sense that we're really interested in human sociality. The key distinction there is that we are constantly centering semiotics and communication as the kind of main thing to look at when we look at human sociality.
So we thought we'd talk a little bit about our organization today and explain a little bit about how the interplay between the psychologists on our team and the other disciplines. We work across 6 domains in terms of our work, which we loosely categorize as behavioral processes. This is the mental process and how mind informs choices. We work in the area of the biosphere, which should not come as a surprise, cultural institutions, and wellness. Those are some of our core functional areas. And then I'm going to turn it over to Jena to explain a little bit about how that plays with the work she does and some of the other programs.
I lead our media research, which is our 4th topical area. And we define media really broadly. So we think about it as any infrastructure or social organization or system that supports mass communication. That means I work with everyone from educational software developers to journalists like the PBS NewsHour. I'm going to say a bit more about that later. And then in addition to the 4 topical areas, we also have 2 research approaches, systems and behaviors. You can think of systems as top-down and behaviors as bottom-up, or in the words of John Voiklis, who leads the behaviors research area, systems assumes that we know what America is, and behavior says, how do we America through our interactions with one another? So really starting from the point that we can't take anything for granted, but have to look at how we construct it in interaction.
So one of the things we do is this work all feeds, we did an inventory of where our work lands in society, and we discovered that our work is being used across this many different domains. And a lot of that work is because we are using a transdisciplinary approach. Our goal is to inform practice. And so these are the practice areas that draw from the kinds of findings we've been publishing. So we should probably explain a little bit about what we mean by transdisciplinary research.
I want to actually differentiate all 3 of these, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary. And let me say, I'm really influenced by the work of 2 scholars here, Julie Thompson-Klein and Lynn English. Multidisciplinary approaches, as Klein puts it, disciplines speak as separate voices to common themes. So it's different ways of approaching the same problem. Whereas interdisciplinary approaches really blend disciplines and link concepts. So you're starting to really talk together. But it's not until you get up to the transdisciplinary approaches that you have to totally restructure disciplines and start from real world problems. It's fundamentally synthetic. You just don't have the purism that you have in disciplinary approaches. In practice, this sometimes means we argue a lot in our office, but functionally really starting from that real world rather than from disciplinary assumptions tends to be our take on almost everything. And to say a little more about how we do that, we've got 2 case studies that we want to get into a little bit of detail about.
So I'm going to dive into the first one, which is our work we've done with the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. That work does represent a transdisciplinary practice, but we wanted to present a quick video to explain a little bit about how that work happened, and also the porosity we have with other organizations. Because while we have a transdisciplinary practice, we also partner with other organizations in order to provide a sort of complementary skill to the skills others bring to the table. So with that.
Visitors to zoos and aquariums know that human behaviors are threatening the biodiversity on which all life depends. For over 20 years, the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, Why Zoos and Aquariums Matter studies have sought to better understand the role that zoos and aquariums play in advancing public science literacy as part of AZA's field-wide research agenda. In 2015, 3 social science research institutes joined with the AZA and a team of leaders from AZA member institutions for the 3rd wave of these studies. The project set out to understand how zoos and aquariums fit in the cycle of learning. Researchers explored the authority the public assigns to zoos and aquariums, the ideas they bring with them when they visit, what they do when they visit, what they take away, and how they integrate the experience and media about these places into their lives. Over 4 years, the project deployed national and in-park surveys, focus groups, observed visitors, and even asked visitors to record their own visits with GoPro cameras. In total, staff at 102 zoos and aquariums across the nation became part of the extended research team. We now know the 7 factors that influence public trust of zoos and aquariums. We've learned that visitors not only make meaning of what they've experienced when they're at exhibits, but also when they're walking between exhibits. We found that adult-only groups are a significant portion of visitors and are looking for advice on how to protect nature. And we now have a better understanding of why learning at zoos and aquariums is so pleasurable. Visitors and the general public have told us that these institutions have a broad authority to help their community to be better wildlife stewards. Zoos and aquariums are a vast collaborative STEM enterprise working to save wildlife and wild places, a role that the public feels is unique. This research has shown that the majority of the general public seeks to construct a better understanding of what they can do to help. They want to know more about the technology that helps explain the problem, understand the creative engineering necessary to support struggling wildlife populations, and to explain the math behind the solutions, the TEM in STEM. The results of this research have produced new methods for studying the STEM learning experience, and the findings are now being used to redevelop professional development programs so that zoos, aquariums, and nature parks across the country can better support their community's learning.
And this is the favorite part of the video for me because that's who played in our research lab. So we do think of everybody as contributing and working out the details together. What I'm going to do is take you through a few of the examples of how transdisciplinary practice produced things we hadn't expected before. In a way, this study does get to that tension Jena was describing between how do we zoo versus what is the zoo, right? Do we believe in a zoo or do we zoo? And so we've discovered one of the things that we thought was really fun. And so this is my little joke for all you psychologists who develop instruments. What is the sort of bias people bring when we ask them about zoos? And we created a very simple scale. How does your zoo perform? And we deployed it at 102 partner institutions to say, compare where you are to where you're not. And the answer came out clearly at the top of the scale, with 397 visitors basically telling us that their home institution is iconic for their area and town and better than every other one in the country. So we don't have any zoos that are below average, or we don't even have any zoos that are average. They're all above average when you ask about zoo. So which means that people are negotiating between 2 biases. There is the place where they are, which could have a confirmation bias to it. And then there is the network or the social setting that means zoo. And so when we talk about the national zoo perspectives on zoos, people are applying something that they benchmark against the one they go to all the time as lesser than. So with that, it means that when we read surveys about the national perspectives on these institutions, they don't necessarily reflect what people are seeing when they go to the one they find most familiar. So the other thing we wanted to do, though, is ask about this conservation issue. We've known for over 15 years that zoos are characterized as conservation organizations. This is the general public, beyond about 3 to 4% of the population that doesn't believe that's true. The rest of the population totally accepts the concept of conservation as something that is attributed to the zoo type. But when we ask people and staff how they define conservation, we find that it's quite different. For the staff, people believe this restoration of nature is an important thing, but you'll see that the visitor is not perceiving that as a priority, and the visitor is seeing the public education, which is one of the zoo's primary goals, right at the bottom of our scale, as something that the public does not assign to their role in conservation. So this was a conversation that was happening between us, both the psychologists on our team, the behavioral psychologists on our team, and developing this survey also involved a sociologist that works with us. So we were really getting to, like, what is that network of belief or bias that comes to the interactions? We also want to know how trust is conferred. And you saw this in the video, so I'll do this rather quickly just to explain its source. We started this project by going to the industrial and organizational literature, looking at how trust is conferred on organizations. In this case, two white guys, Caldwell and Clapham, did some rather cool work in 2003 to understand how businesses work. But we said maybe zoos and aquariums are treated differently. They're public cultural institutions. They are seen as a social good, as a social actor. They operate in many cases with tax support or tax dollars, and they have living beings in their control. So we asked people what they were, and they came up with this different set using almost the same instrument, but going back and iterating with the public, we saw that there was an alignment between what we saw from corporations, but that it played out differently because of this function of the living collections. And we were able to come up with this group of 4 concepts that are all like levers. And effectively, as you turn one of them off, if one of them does not perform, we find that trust is diminished as people accord it to the zoo or the aquarium. And that influences how they're going to work, right? They come in with this mental model of what a zoo is supposed to be doing, and the difference between what they perceive and what they expect is going to affect how they're willing to trust or give authority and learn from these institutions. So with that, we said, and what is different? What is unique? Remember, we said in the video they're unique. So again, we worked on a different kind of analysis to look at topical information and where you learn these types. We did an exercise that involved mixed methods, interviewing focus groups, working with members, national surveys, 2 waves of national surveys, to end up with this set of groups of how people organize where STEM learning is occurring in their lives. This is really across what we define as the STEM learning ecology. And the zoo and aquarium does land somewhat uniquely and remotely from other things. Science centers stand alone, but other museum types tend to group. I think I found this one really fun because planetariums and auto body shops end up being fairly close together with library in terms of the kind of science you're learning. And then interestingly, backyards and front yards are very much part of the zoo and aquarium learning type. So we know that's different. But in the middle of that study, one of our political economists was sitting at the table, and he said, there's something wrong in this data because we also have some information about favorability. And so we said, I mean, it was literally a meeting where in our transdisciplinary practice, someone said, this isn't making sense to me about trust being high, yet favorability being in decline. And we're seeing over the past over a 10-year cycle that favorability was declining for zoos and aquariums. And so it had always been suspected that this had to do with trust. But our results suggest trust has remained stable. So what we discovered was his ability to look at the economic performance of the country and how admissions are changing. Now we have zoos, aquariums, and this other category we call other, but that includes bioparks. So there are places that fit in both categories. They may have a botanic garden, they may be a nature center, and so they don't quite fit the classic, I'm telling you I'm a zoo. But either way, what we're seeing is this change in admission price that's been going on. And in that same period, what we saw was favorability declining, but real price is increasing. And the cost of living, however, has remained flat. And so what we end up with in this study is an example where consumer sentiment has remained high, but favorability has declined. So while trust has remained stable, we know that the bias about what zoos and aquariums do and what I can learn from a zoo and aquarium may not have changed. But thanks to the work of a political economist looking at the same data set, and applying a few external data sets, was able to distinguish the difference between trust versus favorability. So I may still trust you to the nth degree, but somehow I think you're trying to shake me down for cash. What we learned was attendance was continuing to go up. Admission prices were going up. Public had costs basically flat, and that results in one consequence that is of great concern to zoos and aquariums, because we said you may have a challenge should there be an economic downturn. And as everybody knows, we're doing this as a COVID presentation. We are watching a natural experiment about to emerge for the first time in 10 years where we have continuous data and can look at both the mental understanding of what something is and how the political economy intrudes on those perceptions. So that experiment's going on. It's a transdisciplinary study. It's kind of crisis driven, but it's there. And that's how we were able to sort of take a data set and then apply different lenses and different matching data sets to do comparable studies. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jena for the next case study.
My favorite project that we work on, sorry, Johnny.
I love this one too. Know that.
Collaboration, as I mentioned before, with PBS NewsHour. I currently lead that collaboration. It's our 6th year and I believe our 10th grant at this point together. And when I say transdisciplinary, we have Johnny, who's a conservation psychologist. We have me, I'm a linguistic anthropologist. In this photo, we have Nicole, who has a master's in animal behavior. We have a social psychologist. We have a few other people. Also, by the way, Nicole is the only one on the set of the NewsHour who looks like she could actually be on TV. Don't look at either of us. But in addition to all of us and our academic background, we're also working really closely with journalists. It's very much a participatory action research setup. Wait, go back, I'm not there yet. And so the question that we're asking at an overarching level is really, how do we make news better? It's a question of practice and a question of research, and they're not separable. And so some of the questions that underlie this, and I'm going to ask sort of deliberately questions that are disciplinary in nature. What are the psychographic profiles of people who pay attention to different kinds of news? What are the possibly unspoken genre conventions of different social media platforms for news? How do we teach people a functional understanding of statistics through the news? And especially right now where the news cycle remains dominated by one very quantitative news story, which is of course COVID, and quantitative across the board. The economic story has been really quantitative. The educational story has been really quantitative. The case story, as you can see in this image, really quantitative. How do we help people gain a functional understanding of that? So those are some of the questions that underlie how do we make the news better. My other favorite thing about this collaboration is that we do multiple really different kinds of writing. This figure comes from a series of posts on our websites called Numbers in the News. One goes up about every 2 months, and we're looking at some really concrete challenges in statistical understanding in news. I'll spoil a little bit. There's one going up soon about margin of error. A lot of people don't really understand what that is, but it turns out there are some ways you can visualize information that helps them whether or not they understand it. And that's really phenomenal, and that's something we've seen in this series. In addition to this, we've also co-authored, we have a paper out in Journalism Practice with 23 co-authors, more than half of whom are working journalists. And it was really fun to write this paper in conversation between those of us who are primarily social scientists and those of us who are journalists, and all speak together as researchers about the process of making better news. So that's one of my kind of all-time favorites. But I know we also wanted to talk a little bit about our culture and what transdisciplinarity looks like in practice day to day. Tell me why I'm wrong. This is one of our huge underlying tenets. We make a point of bringing in folks who haven't worked on a project and maybe come from a totally different perspective to poke holes in it. So Johnny was talking earlier about bringing in our political economist halfway through a project. Johnny will draft an article and he will call me up and he will say, read this and tell me why I'm wrong. I know you haven't looked at it. Tell me what I'm not thinking about.
Now, there's this other thing that is really part of the pedagogy of our organization, which is that we try to have people focus on where they are successful, identify the gaps, and then we try to backfill in terms of both our hiring and how we look at project management. So if someone is doing something very, very well, we try to figure out how to map the project so the team has all of the complementary skills necessary to accomplish the goal. Our goal is not to make everyone perfect. In a transdisciplinary world, nothing is going to be perfect. But what we're trying to do is ensure that people are doing things they're good at and advancing in that area and identifying, even in terms of self-knowledge, where they may find themselves running up against a wall, and who can complement that work. I'm going to use an example of somebody who works in human rights education. One of the things she's good at has nothing to do with human rights education. It has to do with her ability to synthesize a complicated argument given disparate information and very quickly say, but it's just this, that, and the other. And she honestly can take anybody's research midway through the process. When you explain it all to her over like a 2 to 3 hour thing, she'll turn around and hand you an abstract that explains what you just told her in very clear and coherent terms. She is genius at summarizing. And so even though she works in human rights education and justice issues, we'll bring her in on any project that anyone's working on and just say, we're going to talk at you for an hour. And then she'll just say, oh, I'm fed up, and write your abstract for you and get to the salient point and take out all the chafe and say, this is what you need to say, or you've got 2 separate papers, please go and do them separately. They aren't connected. She also did one of those examples of a paper where we had research and the data didn't make sense. And she came in and made sense of it because she brought in a theory we hadn't even thought of. And we did a post hoc analysis of all of our data and discovered confirmation of something that came from human rights. It wouldn't have come, and community organizing, it wouldn't have come from one of our disciplines that were working on it. So, Jena?
I think this one was you.
Oh,
I think you did 2 slides and 1 anecdote.
Oh, there we go. Sorry. Yeah.
When 2 disciplines hit a wall, add another.
I thought I was actually talking about this. So anyway, the other thing we found is that sometimes we are working in a transdisciplinary setting and we've got 2 concepts mapped. So in this case, with linguistic anthropology and psychology, we are confident in what we're doing and we can't unpack the 2. And we find we bring the 3rd person in, as I was just using my example of the human rights education or political economist, who can take us in a whole different direction and give us new light on the same data.
And then the last thing about our culture that's really key is cultivating habits of public appreciation. So we try to be really mindful about recognizing what other people do well as publicly as possible. The other advantage of that is that it means that person is top of mind when you need someone to work with, where you're already thinking, I want someone who's good at this, so-and-so. So-and-so is the person, that's who I want on my team.
I think as we think about this domain, part of it is giving us the ability to talk about other disciplines and be familiar with their practices, their norms, their conventions, and their knowledge horizons. I think for us, that becomes one of the key issues because each of us brings with us the epistemological base of our research means we end up at a different destination than the other is going to end up at. And by developing the skill of appreciating what others are doing, we're also able to speak more coherently about their disciplines. Although I'm still pathetic at talking about linguistic anthropology, apparently. You'll learn that later.
It's okay, I can't explain conservation psychology. We're even.
So this leads us to some ideas we have about what methodological innovations we're starting to come across that are not so grounded in like a data analysis, but really it's how you think about what research can be and how a transdisciplinary process shifts your perspectives.
So a couple of examples here. What if we treat surveys as interactions? This one came largely out of a conversation between me and my colleague, John Fraser, where John was talking about different ways of analyzing open-ended text data in a survey. And I went, hold on. There's so much information that you're leaving out if you are gonna tell me that the form of this is unimportant. We need to treat this as interactional. We need to take every detail of the form. There's so much that we can get out of how people are saying what they're saying that we haven't looked at. And we now have 2 papers, one in press, one in review on this topic. The first one is 3 colleagues from different linguistic fields taking this data in 3 different directions. And the second one is me and 3 psychologists looking at a very specific data set and coming out of it with an argument. So that's one hypothetical. The next one, what if we crowdsource data through organizations of organizations? So this goes back to some of the work that Johnny was talking about with the AZA, where rather than trying to do a national survey, or rather than trying to work really closely with one zoo and say, okay, great, this is representative, working through the AZA, we were able to crowdsource data from, I think, about 100 different zoos and aquariums, and really be able to speak much better to the national landscape of staff and of users of these organizations. And so that's another methodological paper.
In that case, we were able to, one of the things we did, because this was the first time of working within organizations of organizations, we took a national data set and did the same survey through the parks, and were able to replicate a national data set through the zoo and aquarium network with very small samples from each location. That's a methods paper we're currently demonstrating that, in fact, this is a nice way of getting data, because not only are you looking at the individual general public, but you're also looking at an informed observer's perspective on that, and how valid is the informed observer for telling us about a public phenomenon. So we are doing this now both with AZA, the Association of Children's Museums, and the American Library Association. So we're starting to develop some real skills at thinking about these collectives in our society as sentinels for public sentiment around topics and issues. And lastly,
perhaps most germane to this audience, what if we critique psychological constructs through a linguistic anthropological lens? Okay, Johnny, what's identity? Go, 30 seconds.
For this one, we obviously know ourselves through the somatic self, what I feel, what I touch, my intersubjective exchange, and then how the executive function drives decision-making about how I will present with an anticipated feedback. Going right back to Baumeister. That's my basic quick on self.
Okay, I disagree with you on everything except intersubjectivity.
Tell me why I'm wrong.
Not wrong, but the way I was trained, the social is primary. There is no self except in the social. There is only the intersubjective. Identity is both how am I performing and creating that identity and interaction? How are you ascribing identity to me and treating me in interaction? We have to start from the social.
Right.
And we can go on like this for.
Right, we do. But the example here, you know, I bring attention to Dan McAdams' work on multiple selves because I work in collective identity. So I do tend to think about how people's situational identity and their understanding of self in relation to their idealized norm is expressed and created. And we also look at the transformation they go through within groups and organizations. So I think I'm somewhere in the hybrid. It's not quite so yes and no. And I think everybody in psychology would agree the intersubjective or the cultural context does influence who we are when we are. But I think that the interesting thing about our work is how we look at our data set together comes up with something in the middle. It is a transdisciplinary practice of accounting for different kinds of input to understand people's choices.
We spend a lot of time on definitions too, because some of these concepts like identity, which are really key in all of our fields, but we don't necessarily agree on how to define them or operationalize them. So that's a place where we spend quite a lot of time talking.
Or where they end up in the end, because we think in the end, we end up with the mix of understanding what is happening in the disciplinary understanding of this topic and what is the consequence that we can see. And then that political economy example I gave everyone, it's a chance to also see if there's a countervailing bit of data that we may not have found through our methods. So for us, we wanted to bring this back to what this means. And so for me as a psychologist, this is a really rich and rewarding work environment because it means we are constantly negotiating meaning and bringing literatures that I am unfamiliar with into dialogue and conversations. It means that our papers, our writing, and even our practice is changing and morphing as we learn more and draw on a much broader set of literature. Jenna?
As an anthropologist, I'm very hesitant to answer the question of what this means for psychology. But I do agree with everything that Johnny has said. I think the way that we work together makes our work that much stronger, and heartily encourage everyone to collaborate beyond your discipline. Go find your nearest anthropologist. We don't bite.
Well, I think it does suggest that for psychology, this is an opportunity to see ourselves as a group who can reach out, think about our own practice, but also think about the limits of our practice, the epistemological, base on which we build, and are we really fully engaging? Can we critique psychology from other lenses in order to be more useful to society? So with that, we're going to jump to some pretty obvious ones. If anyone has questions, we'd love to spend the next 20 minutes. We're going to sign off a little early before 1 o'clock because I know people have other things at 1 o'clock usually. So we're going to stop sharing and we'll just do Q&A. And Ezra, can you tell us, should we do it through the chat or how do you want to manage that?
Great. So yeah, if folks have questions, you should load them up into the Q&A section. If you're having trouble finding Q&A, you can always put them in the chat box as well. So, I mean, I have a couple of questions I want to start off with while we give folks a chance to put questions in. One of them is that you all have this incredible team that you've pulled together, John, in a single organization. And so, you have all these different perspectives and you work hard, and it really sounds like you work hard to find ways and to create space very explicitly to bring those perspectives, to allow them to come together, to fight with each other a little bit, to find the tension, and then to see where it resolves. And, and I think it's a fairly unique kind of organization. I mean, there's certainly other groups out there that do this. I wonder, I think a lot of the folks, not everybody, but a lot of folks who've been calling into these webinars sit in academia somewhere. We've got a lot of early career folks. And, as a field, we tend to be a field that really, even if people are coming at it primarily as psychologists because of their training, really values broader perspective than kind of a traditional, let's say, social or cognitive psych kind of approach to answering questions or to solving problems in the world. And I wonder if you have some thoughts about how and whether these kinds of highly collaborative transdisciplinary groups can be set up successfully in kind of more traditional higher ed settings, and say research institutions.
I think it's actually fairly easy. I think the real issue is taking some time to embrace what transdisciplinarity really looks like and letting go just a little bit that we may not have a concrete answer. Like as good psychologists, I think we can hold two ideas in our hands at the same time and understand there is a tension between them, which is productive. And so I am suggesting that it's very doable in academia. In fact, maybe a little easier than in the kind of think tank we set up. I mean, one of the things that we do though is gap analysis. And when we're looking to hire someone for our organization, we'll sit down and say, but we don't have one of these, so we don't know what we're missing. And that's sort of a real conscious process of acknowledging where we have a gap. So we're not that large an organization. We have 14 as our core full-time team, and then we have another 12 research fellows who come in and participate on a question basis. So for example, our ethicist is in Boston, and he engages with us on just about every project, critiquing the ethics and bringing in the ethical literature that could inform the way we see our answers and possibly the biases we may bring to the table that are avoiding sort of central topics. Same thing with developmental psychologists. Somebody asked the question of what stage must a researcher bring in specialists? Well, the answer is really before you start. Transdisciplinarity is a mental model that accepts that there are other ways of seeing exactly this problem. And if you don't start the question there, you may not be aware of all the literature that can inform ways of looking at the problem. Jena, do you have another thought on that?
Yeah, the one other thing that I was going to add to Ezra's question, one of the challenges for a lot of people on the academic side, and we run up against this too sometimes, is a question of incentives, in the sense that even a lot of journals that claim to be interested in interdisciplinary work sometimes don't find it very legible. And so figuring out how to make that work kind of legible to all of the disciplines that are represented in it can be hard. I will speak for myself. I've had an easier time with journals that are sort of more problem or topic focused than disciplinary focused for the most part, for exactly that reason. And actually same on the funding end. Just because of what and how people are trained to read, that can be a real challenge. And especially if you're looking at a tenure committee that only cares about these 5 journals, which I know is sort of a real issue for people, that I think can be a real wall. And I don't want to pretend that's not a real problem. I would also say the other thing that's worked really well for me is reaching out to journals kind of in advance and asking if they're open to certain kinds of work, longer cover letters with more details, again, in service of making the work legible, because I know that's a real challenge for a lot of people.
We have had some journals that are pretty uncomfortable with what we're doing because they're like, but that's not this discipline. And we're like, that's correct, because there is a broader critique here of what's going on.
Full disclosure, one of the papers cited on our slides was desk rejected by 4 journals in a row for being out of scope. So,
and then great feedback on the 5th.
Exactly, great feedback on the 5th.
Yeah.
It looks like, John, you answered one question. Kind of.
Right. There was a question about learning more about the Why Zoos and Aquariums Matter study. We have a website called wasam.org that we encourage anybody to go to learn more about that project and its findings. And there's going to be more. There's another year or so to go in the writing, so that's something that's going to be live. But the question was, did we also include national parks or parks experience and nature centers? And while some nature centers are part of the zoo community, if they have living, animals in some kind of habitat that people can look at. But generally, our goal was to look at the zoo and the aquarium in relation to this universe. And certainly national parks are part of that, as are botanic gardens and science centers. So we did look a little bit at that. We would like to take that much further. I think it's another dimension of the question. The only other thing I'd mention is that there is a project we did with the National Network for Ocean Climate Change Interpretation, which is spelled NNOCCI. And if you search that.org, you will land on our page that explains. Now, that's a project that did look at national parks as well as zoos and aquariums, but it was specifically around understanding climate change and climate change interpretation.
Great. Well, I've got one maybe last question, unless somebody else writes one in, which is, you talked a little bit about this, but I think it'd be useful for folks to hear how you navigate walls that you run into as a team. And, I think in my own work and some of my own efforts to try and work with folks coming from very different perspectives, 2 that I find particularly difficult to integrate are kind of the psychological approach and a political ecology, political economy approach. Because at some point, I often find the political ecologist or political economist just say, everything that the psychologists are focused on is inconsequential. They stop paying attention to individuals, what's going on in their minds. It's all about structure. And the psychologist will then retort with their own responses about, well, where does structure come from? There's people. And I wonder, and I'm sure that you have civil discussions about this in your group, and maybe you've kind of navigated and you've been developing your own transdisciplinary kind of model of decision-making, of the challenges that you face. But I wonder if you do sometimes run into these, you understand each other's language, you do fundamentally disagree, but as a kind of project funded, driven kind of organization, you have to move forward. And maybe that's John's job as the CEO, is just to say, this is where we're going to go. But I wonder if you run into situations like that, or if you've found a way to navigate them.
I want to be clear. We try wherever possible to operate on consensus. Okay, so not everybody is a good fit to our organization. If people want to take a hardcore, narrow disciplinary view of something and exclude others, they're not going to fit with us. Even in our work, though, our transdisciplinary practice extends beyond us to our research partners. Jena gave the example of PBS NewsHour. We operate a participatory action lab with journalists. That means we have to take a lot of time to explain the social science that's here, especially if the person is a journalist who's come from political economy, or a statistician, for example, who is collaborating with Jena right now on this, how do you talk about margin of error? because every math person reading the screen sees the little byline at the bottom that says, oops, 4% variation. And we're like, yeah, no, we need to explain there's some dramatic tension in these numbers here. But I think that, so not everybody's going to want to play. And if people don't want to take a transdisciplinary perspective, but one of the things that's really interesting comes from human rights is conflict transformation theory. And I would highly recommend anyone who's interested in this work, and I'm sorry I don't have a link for it, but we may put one, I'll send you one, Ezra, so that you can add it to your, we have a little thing on our website too. So I'll send you 2 links to put with this webinar. But conflict transformation theory is an approach to looking at where the butting of heads is happening and allows you a process for negotiating that. And it takes an intermediary. So sometimes it's useful to have a third party. So what we were saying about our recommendations, when 2 things hit a wall, that's when you need a third party. You shouldn't try to solve it yourself. Just like, why would someone go to counseling? Because they can't solve the problem themselves. So why not bring a third party in to say, why are we not talking? What is going on? What is the conflict here? So that you can take out the personal or the sense that I'm diminishing someone's research perspective by saying, but that's not the way I see it. Jenna, what are you thinking on that one?
We've also done, in a couple of cases, I'm thinking about papers where we've written a discussion section that was very transparent about disciplinary positionality, and have had a discussion section that basically went, as a conservation psychologist, Johnny thinks this. As a linguistic anthropologist, Jenna thinks this. We sort of all have different sets of implications that we want to focus on. We don't agree on what's the most interesting, so we're going to put it all out there and tie it to where each of us is coming from. And that's been fruitful too. Especially, I think, in cases where we tried to write something that we would all sign off on and that was just not going to happen. Because sometimes it's not. But the more explicit everyone can be about their starting points, often that at least points to sort of, it depends on where you're going, what's the interesting part. Really thinking about the case Ezra pointed out, where the interesting part is not the same for everyone.
I think one of the things that's been interesting about doing that is that we now have this thing on our website called the Idea Brewery, where sometimes we'll put ideas we're thinking, okay, that landed at the end of a project, let's just post it and see if it happens. And we had a funder come to us and say, I'm really interested in that idea that none of us would have thought was going to be the super thing that funder was going to pay attention to. So part of the consequence of these dialogues is actually producing new research questions we hadn't imagined before, even in my discipline, in Jenna's discipline, or somewhere in that hybrid space. And so we try to take time, and if it's not going to be in a peer-reviewed paper, it's not going to be in a report, we will publish it on our website so that we can start to gather others around that question.
Great. It looks like there's one final question.
From Aditya.
Yeah, thinking about how these results might compare in other countries with different biospheric and values, or kind of just general value.
I think what we're talking about here is the WASAM study that I talked about earlier. So we can't generalize to other countries for our work. I know that a lot of people are building on that work. So for example, there's a fellow at Warwick University in the UK who's just moved to Thailand, who's been doing studies of learning in zoos and aquariums around the world. And we know that they are starting to take some of these concepts and apply them. The one thing I can say is that when we did the association level benchmarking study, we find consistent results in the United States compared to what that baseline research was finding around the world. And so zoo users are still looking at the zoo as a normative understanding of our community's concern for nature. And so, it's the Sao Paulo Zoo is going to be judged by a completely different benchmark because of the degree of urban poverty that surrounds that zoo and what surrounds sort of life where there is so much more discordance in terms of economic income. So let's see. Sorry, Kelly just asked a question. Hey, Kelly, I'm glad you're here. Sorry, we haven't answered the question, but the lesson learned doc is really, we don't have one because this is an ongoing experiment. So I think that we're just trying to mess with the theory and keep it top of mind. You know, some of the basic rules here, though, are kindergarten rules, right? Play nice with others, don't hit, that kind of thing. So share your toys. And it's really around share your toys. That's kind of the whole lessons learned.
Don't take it personally, I think, is the biggest one. I know Ezra asked before, you know, do things just resolve as Johnny is the boss and what he says goes? Johnny is the boss and respects you more if you say to his face, you're wrong. You know, not all the time, but if you have a really good rationale for doing so, he is very comfortable with that. I don't think any of us will take a you're wrong personally, as long as it's coming from a reasoned argument and it's not knee-jerk. And I think that sort of humility and ability to not take anything personal is really important to our ability to work together when we do often have even different epistemological standards of what counts as useful evidence.
I will say we have on our team somebody who takes responsibility for HR. We have a chief operating officer who comes from education policy, and the two of them both work with the team. So we don't assume we're going to resolve conflicts completely ourselves, right? They are brought into the table, and even though so the person who manages our HR is an actress, and she does qualitative interviewing, beautiful, beautiful qualitative interviews. But as an actress, she'll often sort of look at this and go, whoa, we got drama here we don't need, and help us see the drama in our conversation and the topic. And so I think that part of the story is one of the lessons learned for us is, you know, understand how your disciplinary silo can cause you to be in conflict and how external parties can help you get over that. That's really the only, you know, big lesson. But how to set it up, gap analysis. That's the other thing. Like, I don't know what I don't know. But I think, you know, pedagogy, you know, our values, everyone's wrong and everyone has ideas to help get toward right.
Great. Well, thank you both for joining us this month. And I hope folks found that to be an interesting and stimulating conversation. And I'll put this video up on the website, on the Division 34 YouTube web channel. And just want to thank you both for joining us today and signing off for everybody.
Thanks so much.